he's an exemplar of what loyal and patriotic Americans do when they are trying to advance maybe their ethnic group, but also the society at large. And Washington was always trying to, at the same time that he was most keen on helping African Americans, he was always trying to make a better nation.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at BRI, and we're pleased to bring you another episode in our series on Black intellectuals and the African American experience. We are honored to have scholar Jeff Norrell, who is going to discuss Booker T. Washington. Now, the guiding question for this series is, what contribution did this person make to understanding the Black experience in America? Now, Dr. Robert Jeff Norrell is a professor of history and Bernadotte Schmitt Chair at the University of Tennessee. He's the author of several books on race in America, including Reaping the Whirlwind, The Civil Rights Movement in Tuskegee, and Up from History, The Life of Booker T. Washington. Jeff, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Great. One of the reasons I really love your biography, and it weaves together his thoughts on education and politics and race. You do that so well, but you also, paint just a wonderful portrait of his life as the leader, the very busy leader of Tuskegee, as well as his personal life. So all those strands are kind of woven together in a very compelling biography. So congratulations.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Well, my first question is, Booker T. Washington wrote his famous autobiography, of course, Up from Slavery, detailing his early life and education. So how did his formative experiences shape his understanding of the best means to Black progress?
Well, Washington gives a very clean, cleansed view of his background and experience. I won't say he whitewashes it, but Washington was a superb person at public relations. He understood instinctively what you should and should not say to maximize your public relations effect. And so Up from Slavery is, I think, a really, remarkable account of his life, but it is not his whole life. It's not all that happened to him. So that things that he saw and experienced that shaped his strategy going forward was not included altogether in that book. And one of the interesting things was that I was trying to do was to square his public presentation of himself with his private experience. And so he was shaped by some very positive things that he could talk about openly, but also by some troubling things that happened to him privately that he did not he did not present to the public. So Washington was shaped by his background. He was powerfully influenced by his mother, who was determined that her children were educated and had a chance to live a better life than she had as an illiterate slave woman most of her life. And so he was clearly her child, and he never forgot that. And of course, his father is never really named, but his father was, in all likelihood, a white man from the neighborhood they lived in Virginia near Roanoke. And so, but Washington never discussed who his paternity on that side. Washington was very resentful of people who very often said his genius as a person, as a leader, as a college president, had to result from the fact that his white paternity, and Washington very much resented that. And because for all of the aspersions cast on him in his life and afterward for being an Uncle Tom, he was very much a man of pride in who he was as an African American. So Washington, I encourage people to read Up from Slavery, but you know, if you want a little bit more texture about who he was, Up from History is a more detailed and truthful account. Not to say that Up from Slavery is inaccurate. It just leaves out a lot.
Right, and so and he also acquired a a love for books and sort of a thirst for learning, and eventually went off to Hampton Institute, right?
Yes, and here I give a lot of credit to the lady he worked for, Virginia, who he was in effect her houseboy or butler, but she was so intent. She was a New England lady from New England. Her husband was a coal operator there in West Virginia, so they were of substantial means. But she really took to Booker, and she immediately saw his potential, and she began to instruct him in all kinds of ways that benefited him for the rest of his life. Most clearly, I think she was responsible for his excellent verbal skills. He spoke with sort of an accent. There are recordings that are available. He spoke with the accent of a kind of upper middle class Southerner. Didn't have many of the revealing kinds of accents of an African American at that time, because African American accents at that time were very distinctive and to our ear today would be a little bit hard to understand. But Washington, it was like you would imagine, a planter from Virginia speaking. And anyway, this lady who was from New England, and no doubt spoke with a New England accent, but she was such a stickler for precise grammar and speech and pronunciation. And that served our Book of Washington so well in so many ways throughout the rest of his life.
Right. Now, Washington helped establish and build Tuskegee Institute into a major center of Black education. And, how does his work at Tuskegee reflect his views on what was important about Black education and advancement?
Washington came to Tuskegee to build essentially elementary and middle school, which meant that he had to be able to start students at the beginning of their education. And he didn't make any apology about that. The whole, he frequently noted that the whole of the Black South was seeking education at the same time because they had been denied it throughout their history. So his idea was education for the Black masses made as accessible as possible. And at the same time, he became a kind of creature, apostle for the promotion of black education, to try to persuade the white South that educating blacks was a good idea. And this, of course, occurred at a time when there was intense hostility to any education, any African American. So Washington would never openly talk about the intense hostility he and all African Americans faced in the South from white supremacists who didn't want any black to get any education. And that was, an underlying structural reality that Washington struggled with his whole career. So Tuskegee Institute he created as a kind of symbol of the ability of African Americans to learn, the ability of African Americans to provide an education for their children, and to some extent for African Americans to acquire white support for that mission. This was he had no more fundamental desire in his set of ambitions than that. Now, he wanted African Americans to have the right to vote, and he worked on that all through at the same time. But for him, the twin education was really the more fundamental thing, and the thing that he believed was in greatest jeopardy.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you kind of alluded to this, but, Washington often had to walk a fine line among different audiences. For example, many blacks wanted to seek an education and progress. On the other hand, as you said, white Southerners were scrutinizing him in Tuskegee and trying to prevent that. White philanthropists were willing and donated money. And also, as you detail in the book, there were many black critics who were contending for leadership of the black community in America. So how does he navigate all these different groups to achieve his goals, and sort of overcome these constraints that bind him as a public figure?
Well, he overcame them when he did overcome them, and he didn't always, by paying close attention to, the people with whom he was contending, so that he had to watch all the time these really dangerous white supremacists. And he encountered them in every state. And once he became a kind of national celebrity in 1895, then they all aimed at him and tried to take him down. And I'm talking about people like Tom Heflin in Alabama, Tom Watson in Georgia, the novelist they're all Tom Dixon in North Carolina. The Toms were all out for him, and they had a special hatred of Washington because they had a sense that his desire was so fundamentally a challenge to white supremacy that he had to be knocked down. Washington understood that. He never willingly took them on one-to-one. He always was working kind of by sleight of hand about thwarting them, the people, the white supremacists who were against education, and became essentially enemies of Washington. So he did a whole lot on the African American side. Now, this was the one that I guess was the most controversial in terms of my trying to explain Washington in a different way, was that the general sort of opinion among historians was, at least when I started working on this, was that Washington was an unpopular fellow among his fellow African Americans because most people agreed with W.B. Du Bois that Washington was really an Uncle Tom who was a sycophant to the rich white people who did not want blacks to get education. And I thought that was the wrong interpretation. It was very interesting to try to sort out how Washington dealt with people like Du Bois, and there were many others as well who essentially agreed with Du Bois. But what I realized over time was that the average black person in the South appreciated what Washington was trying to do. And if Washington dissembled or misled or lied a little bit to white folks in order to preserve himself, to preserve his institution, they understood that. They didn't have the same kind of hostility to Booker that Du Bois had and that people in Du Bois' circle had. So it was quite interesting to try to sort that out, the criticism of him. And so I'm not sure I did persuade all that many people that Washington was in fact a pretty popular guy in, amongst his constituency, but I was fully persuaded of it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And you argue that Washington's seeming accommodationist stance in speeches such as the Atlanta Exposition Address actually belied how much he did publicly and also privately to challenge segregation, lynching, disfranchisement, defunding of public schools, and the host of other injustices that were going on at the time. Can you explain the dichotomy between the image and the reality?
Washington was a superb guy at public relations, and he understood that there were ways to say things that would not create controversy, and there were ways to say things that would. And so he essentially tried to steer clear of creating controversy. But that didn't mean that he ever really agreed to the disfranchisement of African Americans. He didn't. It didn't mean he went along with the denial of education to black people. He never did that. And he never consented to lynching. He always condemned that. So that if you actually read the record very carefully, you didn't find, I didn't find much evidence that he would mealy-mouthed about, the matter of life and death, education and ignorance, participation in democracy, or denial. He was on the right side of every one of those issues. And if you read his speeches carefully, you will see, plenty of evidence of his being a stand-up guy. If you read his interviews with journalists, and he was constantly interviewed by journalists, you see him sticking up on the right side of all of that.
The final question is a big one, but we have just a few minutes. What was Booker T. Washington's contribution to understanding the Black experience in America?
A wise historian once said, the lessons taught aren't always the lessons learned. And Washington was really trying to teach a lesson that Black people are good, and they're loyal and patriotic Americans, and they're good neighbors, and they have made good contributions to this nation, and they will make better contributions if they're given education and a chance to make a living and a chance to vote and all of the regular things that Americans get. So that he's an exemplar of what loyal and patriotic Americans do when they are trying to advance maybe their ethnic group, but also the society at large. And Washington was always trying to, at the same time that he was most keen on helping African Americans, he was always trying to make a better nation. He knew it would be a better nation if Americans were fairer in their treatment of Black people. And he tried to explain to whites that it was in their interest to be decent to Black people and not to be ugly and disparaging as people were all around him at the time. So I think that was maybe it's as a symbol of how one advances progress in America that I think was his greatest contribution.
Okay, excellent. Jeff, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Up From History is really an excellent biography, and I really recommend it.
Thank you, Tony.
Great. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other installments in the series Black Intellectuals and the African American Experience, our previous series on the Cold War and the presidency, and our upcoming series on pivotal battles in American history. Thank you for joining us.